Good afternoon, everybody. There's a lot to unpack in the Civil Liberties Unit, so I decided to break it up into a few different videos. The first of which I want to focus on just simply the basics of what civil liberties are, what they're all about. So let's first just take a look at this first slide here. Um, This first slide is ultimately looking at what is the definition of civil liberties. And just like we discussed today with the COVID-19 and how the government's responding to that, it has to do with how governments are effectively balancing our freedoms with our need for safety and order. Well, those freedoms and what protects those freedoms are our civil liberties. So that's ultimately what protects us. So what you can see here is that personal freedoms that are protected for all individuals and that are generally deal with individual freedoms and restrain government's infringement of such freedoms. In other words, it's holding them back. And my question to you is, what are some others here? We discussed a bunch today, particularly in fourth period. So be thinking about what those liberties are, what they represent. The next thing that I wanted to do was separate out for you guys the difference between civil liberties and civil rights. We talked about two different clauses within the 14th Amendment that is so critical here. You have the Due Process Clause over here, and you have the Equal Protection Clause over here. Recognize the very different role that each of these play. A lot of people like to use the term rights interchangeably with civil liberties and civil rights. But if they use the term civil rights, recognize that this is what they're talking about. In other words, I can't treat people of different genders, of different races, of different nationalities different as far as the law is concerned. This is more about telling the government what they cannot take away. You know that the government cannot take away your freedom of speech. They cannot take away your freedom of religion. Yes, we discussed some possible areas where they might restrict some of those freedoms, and we'll get to those shortly. But for now, we need to understand that liberties are about protecting us from government intervention, whereas civil rights are more about assuring that all people are treated equally. The second part that I wanted to address here was that how civil liberties are viewed differently. For instance, which side here might conservatives value more? Which side here might liberals value more? Be thinking on that. Whether or not you're talking about Edward Snowden, like we did earlier this year. Liberals might consider him one way, conservatives might think about him in another way. That very much has to do with your ideas of liberty and where those liberties are most important. Women focus on reproductive rights. Is that more of a conservative view, or is that more of a liberal view here? So be thinking about liberty in that kind of area, and I think it'll help guide some of your thinking there as well. I also want you guys to really understand the significance of the Bill of Rights. I'm not a big believer in memorizing a whole lot of stuff, but the Bill of Rights is one thing that, yeah, you really need to get it down, memorized pretty well. Today we discussed 5 freedoms within the First Amendment that you guys can see up here. I'm not going to list these out right now. You don't need to pay a whole lot of attention to the Third and the Seventh Amendment, but later videos that I'm going to be showing you guys are going to be focusing on the First Amendment, the Second Amendment, the Fourth, the Fifth, the Sixth, as well as the 8th, and finally the 10th will be kind of a factor throughout a number of them. But the 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th are all really about rights of the accused or potential criminals. So that's an easy way to kind of group those together there on that. So kind of keep that part in mind. What is the basis of a lot of our protections of our civil liberties actually comes from the 14th Amendment. I know that we view the Bill of Rights as really key to that, but the 14th Amendment helped us get those protections at the state and local level. So it's important to note here that this one right here, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. This is the focus on civil liberties side, that due process of law. So today we talked about when someone is arrested, they have to have their rights read to them. They have to have an attorney. They have to have the right to be charged. Like, for instance, the Japanese weren't even charged for a crime during World War II, hence their habeas corpus liberties were unprotected in that instance. But that has to do with the due process of law. This focuses on the equal protection of that and that naturalization part. But all of those really come out of the 14th Amendment, which protects us at the state and local level. The Fifth Amendment is what protects our due process liberties at the federal level, but only at the federal level. The 14th Amendment goes further. The reason why the 14th Amendment becomes so significant is because before that, before the 14th Amendment and before the court was interpreting that, you can see here that with this Barron versus Baltimore, that the federal government flat out states that your rights are not protected at the state and local level. The federal government's Bill of Rights are only about protecting federal liberties there, federal points there. So I think it's important to note that Barron versus Baltimore basically said, hey, look, states, local governments, you can basically do what you want relative to the Bill of Rights in a number of different areas, and many did. It isn't until they become selectively incorporated through the 14th Amendment that becomes possible. So that's a really important concept, is selective incorporation. We take it for granted that all of our Bill of Rights are protected in the state and local levels. They are not. There are a number of protections that are not available at the state and local level. Most are, but some aren't. Take a moment to kind of look at which ones are and which ones aren't. You can see here the gradual application of parts of the Bill of Rights to states, first, second, and fourth. But these ones are only partially incorporated, the Fifth and the Eighth Amendments. The Sixth only partially. For instance, lawyers for poor people, a lot of poor people, as you saw in New Jim Crow, don't get attorneys, yet alone competent ones in a timely fashion. So that really comes into play. Third and Seventh haven't been incorporated at all. So none of them, none of the amendments here have been fully incorporated. Only these have been largely incorporated. So make sure that you kind of take that into play. These specific areas of the rights of the accused have been selectively incorporated. Matt versus Ohio is one of your landmark cases, as is Gideon versus Wainwright is another. Pay attention to those. But what I want you guys looking at as well is, okay, well, once you protect the rights of the accused with some of these laws here, what are some potential consequences of that? When we're looking at that liberty order scale here, obviously you're tilting more towards liberty. Is it too much? Is it not enough? Like, are they missing kind of the order component here? What are some potential drawbacks to that? And here are a variety of different areas of the cases that ultimately protect those specific rights here. Please compare this list again with your landmark cases list there. Again, you see Matt versus Ohio here. You see Gitlow versus New York. So those are cases to pay attention to. So, this one here, Robinson versus California, indicated to the state of California that they couldn't arrest someone and put them in jail simply for being addicted to drugs. Whereas if California sought to carry out the death penalty and another state didn't, they could. And the reason why that's the case is that the protections against the death penalty, or the interpretation that it's violating the Eighth Amendment's cruel and unusual punishment aspect, hasn't been fully incorporated at the state and local level just yet, largely because the federal courts have not interpreted it that way. Guys, that is the first of one of our few, actually probably one of our many liberties videos. You can tell that there's a lot to unpack here, but I hope that you feel that you have some grasp on some of the basic concepts of liberties as protections against state and federal governments, or even local governments in some cases there, and what aspects of the Constitution ultimately protect those. I hope you also saw the incredibly important role of the 14th Amendment. If you have questions on these, please don't hesitate to take those to class or office hours. Thanks for your time, and have a good day, everybody. Bye-bye.